Recording and here we go, and let folks in. Okay, well, welcome to this evening's Stinson Beach Adaptation and Resilience Collaboration Adaptation webinar. My name is Ben Gettleman. I work with Kearns and West, part of the stakeholder engagement team. I'm going to be helping to facilitate the webinar this evening. I'm going to kick off the webinar tonight just by talking through our objectives and agenda for the meeting. We'll do some introductions and then we'll get into the content of the presentation. So let's go to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview of our objectives for today. We want to start with a kind of a high-level overview of where we are in the Stinson ARC process, and then we'll dive in a little bit more specifically to findings from a recent report that looks at the pros and cons of different sea level rise adaptation options for Stinson Beach. We'll also present next steps, and then importantly, we want to make sure we provide the opportunity for participants to ask questions. Let's go to the next slide, please. So just some recommended participation guidelines to make sure that folks have the opportunity to participate. We just recognize this is an important topic and there's different opinions. We just request that everyone be respectful of one another's opinions. The way that we're going to structure the webinar is we're going to have some presentation up front, and then we'll have Q&A towards the end of the meeting, and we'll end the meeting with Q&A, but we'll have presentation, then Q&A. In order to get through as many questions as we can, we just ask folks to share the floor, and so we can get your questions answered and get on to the next question. So the way in terms of the settings, we will have participants muted as we're in the presentation mode, and the chat's also going to be disabled in the presentation mode. And when we get to Q&A, we'll open up the chat, and we'll also unmute people as we get to questions. And just recognizing this is a Zoom, there's different settings. Please be patient as we're going through it. We do have a web manager, Katie, who's helping with that. So feel free to send a note to Katie if you're having any issues, and she'll help get those resolved. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just a few notes on this Zoom meeting that we're having. You'll see that the chat is on the lower bar. You can ask questions or provided as we get to the Q&A section. You can also raise your hand and we can call on you. So those are the two ways to ask questions in the meeting. If you're interested in having closed captions, you can turn on that feature. And again, if you need any technical assistance, please do send a note to Katie and she'll be able to help you out. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, I'm just going to let folks look at this slide. We've got several members of the team, both from Marin County Community Development Agency and then the consultant team. We're here to provide information, answer questions, and make this as productive as we can be. Okay, so before we move on to the presentation, we're going to pull up a poll. We have a question for you all to answer. Our question is, what's your connection to Stinson Beach? So please take a second and note what's most relevant to you. Okay, so certainly seeing a lot of residents and homeowners, some folks who are their work is related to Stinson Beach, and some general interest and no visitors yet. So, okay, I think that's what we've got. So thanks for filling that out. That's really helpful for us to know who's on the call. So thank you. All right, so I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Isaac Perlman with the County Community Development Agency to give an overview of the Stinson ARC project.
Great, thanks, Ben. Next slide, please. So I think Ben talked a little bit about our outline, what we're going to be doing today, but I'll give a little bit of overview about our project. And so for those who don't know me, as Ben said, my name's Isaac Perlman. I'm the project manager for the Stinson Adaptation and Resilience Collaboration. It's nice to see some familiar names in our attendee list. But for those who don't, yeah, as Ben said, we've been working on this project for a couple of years. Before we jump into the report and the results of the report that we just released, I wanted to just do a quick overview of what is the Stinson Beach Arc and its goals. So first and most important, I think it's important to note that Stinson Arc is not a regulatory planning process. So for those of you who have been involved with the local coastal program update, which governs coastal development in Marin County, that is different than this process. Ours is a grant-funded educational process where we're providing analysis, reports, and information for the Stinson community to help them make informed adaptation decisions. One of the first steps in this process was to update the previous vulnerability assessment that had been done for Stinson Beach back in 2016. So with our lead technical consultant, ESA, who we're going to hear from later, James will kind of give an overview of that assessment, but collecting the best available data and most recent available data was the first step that we did last year. We're kind of in this third step now. So working with the technical team to look at what adaptation measures are possible for Stinson Beach and what their pros and cons are. And we'll be talking a lot more about that today. And then the last step of this process is going to be developing an adaptation roadmap with suggested next recommendations and next steps for the community. Next slide, please. So why is this project needed? For those of you who live in Stinson or work in Stinson or visit Stinson even, I'm sure it's no surprise to know that flooding has been a part of Stinson Beach for a long time. In the last 2 years alone, we've had East Cook Creek overtop its banks multiple times, as well as two significant coastal storms in each of the last 2 winters. So we know flooding happens in Stinson Beach, and we know with sea level rise that flooding is going to get worse if we don't take any action. And when I say worse, we're talking about impacts to home and properties, damage to community infrastructure, and loss of beach and marsh habitat, which is part of what makes Stinson Beach such a special place. Next slide. So there are a lot of stakeholders for this project that we've been communicating with throughout when we started a couple years ago. Of course, residents and homeowners. Another big important stakeholder for this process is what we call land and critical infrastructure managers. I see a few who are here tonight, but that's us working with and coordinating very closely with, for example, the Stinson Beach Water District, Caltrans, and other local, state, and federal agencies that manage land out in Stinson. Our regulatory agencies and technical experts are the ones who help us understand what's possible in terms of adaptation measures for Stinson Beach. And then another big important stakeholder component to this project are beach visitors and the businesses that serve them. And one of the first analyses or studies of this Stinson Arc project was a visitation study, which found that Stinson Beach receives about, on average, 600,000 visitors per year. And then some of the other stakeholders that are part of this project that we've been engaging include a lot of the West Marin environmental nonprofits, like West Marin Environmental Action Committee. Next slide. So lastly, just to overview the process very quickly, as I mentioned, the first year was all about updating that vulnerability assessment. As I said, James will do a very quick recap. We have a long, detailed report available on our website. We're kind of wrapping up this phase 2 right now. So identifying and evaluating the potential adaptation measures. This summer, we'll be doing some extensive engagement with stakeholders as we work to develop our draft adaptation and pathways and roadmap before we take it to the public for comment. And then our goal is to, by the end of this year, complete that, have the final adaptation roadmap and wrap up this project. Next slide. So with that, I will hand it over to James Jackson, our lead technical engineer and a consultant for this project with Environmental Science Associates.
Thanks, Isaac. Thanks for the warm introduction. It's good to be here. And yeah, I'm going to take a few minutes to give a brief overview of our vulnerability assessment update, and then I'll get into more on our latest documents on adaptation measures. So first of all, we updated the sea level rise vulnerability assessment, building on the county's prior assessment of the coastal areas in Marin on the Pacific side, and that was conducted in 2016. And this update specifically for Stinson Beach addresses the sea level rise scenarios and combined storm conditions. It incorporates new information on Stinson Beach assets and resources, as well as the different coastal hazards that are relevant to the Stinson Beach community. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes our sea level rise scenarios that we evaluated for the vulnerability assessment and what we will be carrying forward with our adaptation analysis. The sea level rise scenarios here build on the latest state guidance. We conducted the vulnerability assessment update last year and finalized it earlier this year. So we were relying on the 2018 state guidance with the timing for each sea level rise shown in the middle column. But just a few weeks ago, the state has officially adopted its new sea level rise science and policy guidance. And so we're showing the new timing of this planning scenario based on the latest and greatest science. And so basically for this planning horizon, which is a high risk, medium high risk aversion, it's a precautionary projection of sea level rise timing that we use for community-wide planning. And the dates for each of these scenarios has shifted a little bit into the future based on the newest science. And so 1.6 feet, for example, is now projected at 2060 as it was previously projected at 2050. Next slide, please. So the different hazards that we evaluated for this vulnerability assessment update include regular tidal inundation from monthly high tides, as well as extreme storm impacts from the 100-year coastal storm. And we've also included coastal storm wave run-up hazards. We've evaluated beach and dune erosion. So an update on the coastal erosion projections. We've included dune erosion in this, as well as average beach widths during summer and winter. The vulnerability assessment update also incorporates groundwater levels and emergence, which are a new data set that became available since the countywide study. And groundwater is particularly important to wastewater treatment in the community, which I'll speak to. And we've also included Eastcoot Creek flooding hazards in our analysis. Next slide, please. To give a high-level summary here, I'm just going to show this slide that summarizes the vulnerabilities today and with 1 feet of sea level, 1.6 feet of sea level rise. I'm just going to read off what's going on today. And in summary, homes and properties are at risk from 100-year coastal storm flooding. There are approximately 240 buildings in that 100-year flood risk zone. An additional number of buildings, 120, are also in the creek flood hazard zone from Eastcoot Creek. And folks that regularly visit Stinson and drive down Calle de Arroyo know that the king tides commonly inundate Calle de Arroyo under today's conditions. Beaches and dunes today are exposed to storm erosion, such as events during the El Nino and most recently the January 2023 coastal storms, which eroded beaches and impacted development. Marshes are under existing conditions limited to narrow band areas in the Stinson community in between development homes and roadways. And so with sea level rise, these marshes have limited space to migrate and will shrink with sea level rise without action. Shoreline Highway, a major transportation route through the area, which provides access to the north to Stinson, is exposed to coastal storm surge in a couple of locations along Bolinas Lagoon, and with just 1.6 feet of sea level rise, nearly 2/3 of a mile of the road in different locations can be exposed to monthly high tides. And then notably, septic systems and utilities in Stinson are at risk from seasonal high groundwater under existing conditions. 480 parcels are shown to be in the risk category of being impacted by those high groundwater during the wet season. Septic systems need a certain amount of distance in the ground to properly treat water. And so this is one of the major and first issues that the community will face. Next slide, please. So with that brief summary of the vulnerability assessment, again, the full report is available on the county's website. There are also other great resources, such as the county's visualization tool, which is a virtual reality visualizer. And they also have a story map that are all on that county web page. So go ahead and find more information there. I'm now going to take some time to discuss our first steps into the adaptation analysis, determining what can be done here in the community. I want to take this moment to recognize our team of experts. We've got a number of sub-consultants that supporting the team to provide input on regulatory issues, the environment, utilities, economics, as well as the engagement and visualization. So just want to take a second to give kudos to our great team. Excuse me. Okay, so first of all, I want to just establish the framework here. When we're talking about sea level rise adaptation analysis, there are a lot of industry standards and guidance out there to help inform this process. And in general, we need to understand the what, the where, and the when. And so our adaptation analysis framework incorporates this standard approach in which we define our options first. What are the applicable adaptation measures that could be used to address hazards in the community? It's important to evaluate the trade-offs associated with each different adaptation approach. And so we are utilizing a standard set of criteria that I'll describe in a couple minutes to evaluate not just how effective a measure is, but what are some of the other considerations that should be considered when evaluating different adaptation approaches. We need to understand when. So a certain action is needed at some point to prevent hazards from impacting. So whether that's floods from impacting a home or tides impacting a road. And so we establish these thresholds in time based on progressing hazards. In order to make sure an adaptation measure is implemented in a sufficient time frame so that it is there when you need it, you also need to consider the lead time that's required to plan, permit, and design these adaptation measures. And so a trigger for action, and it considers when the measure is physically needed as well as that lead time. And so with all these considerations, the what, the where, and the when, we can, as a project team, develop and analyze example adaptation pathways. And what we mean by adaptation pathways is these are case studies of potential future adaptation approaches that combine a number of measures to address all the hazards that are present in the community. Next slide, please. So to start here and provide some potential adaptation measures, I've broken things down in between the beach side of the community, the lagoon and creek side of the community, and the interior or groundwater related issues. And so along the beach, there are a number of potential adaptation measures that could be applied. Those include beach nourishment, vegetated dunes and cobble berms, traditional shoreline armoring, such as revetments and seawalls. We could elevate structures and infrastructure, as well as manage relocation and retreat. Next slide, please. Along the lagoon and creek side, we've got the Bolinas Lagoon with its potential for storm surge flooding, as well as king tide inundation and the flood risk from East Good Creek. these images on the right indicate the relative potential flooding risks. This image on the top shows Calle de Arroyo being inundated by king tides. Along the lagoon and creek side, we could potential adaptation measures include horizontal levees, also known as ecotone levees, that provide flood protection, but include a wide slope that helps to facilitate habitat shifts with sea level rise. More traditional flood protection measures, such as bulkheads or vertical flood walls, and more traditional levees to prevent flooding from development. We could also elevate waterproof structures and infrastructure on the lagoon side. Raising grades with imported fill is another way to bring properties above the floodplain. There's stormwater management considerations. Specifically, Seadrift Lagoon has some water control structures that may need to be reconfigured or updated with sea level rise. We have managed relocation, realignment, and retreat, as well as creek flooding management, such as sediment management, periodic removal of sediment in the creek to increase its conveyance capacity, and other potential measures like flood bypasses. Next slide, please. Potential adaptation measures to address groundwater, elevated groundwater in the community also include elevating and waterproofing structures and infrastructure, raising grades. There's groundwater management measures such as dewatering wells that help to lower the groundwater table to reduce impacts to subsurface or on the ground assets. There's conversion of septic on-site wastewater treatment systems or upgrading to a community wastewater treatment approach, and other utilities adaptation considerations like utilities connections and transmission through the community that may be impacted by rising groundwater. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through a few slides here to show and describe the 3 documents that we've developed to summarize the work, this initial work on adaptation analysis. That includes the adaptation analysis memo shown on the top right. That provides the framework and description of the different parameters for the analysis. We have detailed adaptation measures exhibits, which compile all of the adaptation measures and include descriptions and considerations for each evaluation criteria. And we also have an adaptation summary matrix, which is shown on the bottom right. And that provides very high-level summaries for each adaptation measure so that they could be compared and one can understand the relative trade-offs at a high level. And all of these documents are available now on the county website for access and for your review. Next slide, please. So the adaptation analysis memo, again, it provides a framework for evaluating our potential holistic adaptation alternatives. And it describes the different types of tools or measures that could be used. It presents the evaluation criteria, as well as the sequencing framework that I mentioned previously, physical thresholds and triggers for action that include lead times. Next slide, please. I wanted to summarize the evaluation criteria that we've applied in this study, and this is a standard set of criteria to be used in adaptation planning, and they include engineering. Engineering considerations include feasibility. Is something buildable based on the available space and the setting? Its effectiveness, is a particular measure expected to perform as intended? And as well as its resilience, or in other words, how much a particular measure might need to be maintained over time, or how long might it last. The second evaluation criteria is the environmental impacts and benefits associated with an adaptation measure, and that's both the initial implementation or temporary impacts, as well as long-term permanent impacts that could be expected based on the evolution of coastal processes and the related hazards. Regulatory considerations is the third evaluation criteria for permitting and other coordination considerations that are relevant to each of the adaptation measures. We have social considerations, and these include public access to and along the shore, the recreational uses, as well as social equity. And then finally, economics, and the cost of potential cost for adaptation measures, their scale. So does a measure address hazards just on one parcel, or is this a multi-parcel or greater area type of measure? And accordingly, does it provide multiple benefits? So again, more can be found in our adaptation memorandum on these standard criteria. Next slide, please. I want to give a quick preview of our adaptation measures exhibits and just point out what can be found in these measures exhibits. And so for each of the adaptation measures, I think we've got a little over 20 different individual adaptation measures. We've developed these easy to use and accessible graphic based forms that help to describe and characterize the different measures. The box shown here highlights the kind of key parameters associated with each measure, including the type of measure, if it's natural or nature-based, or if it's a more traditional measure, the name of the measure, the type of strategy that this measure employs, the location that the measure could be used on the beach or on the lagoon side, examples of local locations in the region where this type of measure has been implemented, and the hazards that each measure can address with its use. Next slide, please. The other portion of these exhibits on the right side starts with a description of the adaptation measure and shows some photo examples and provides additional details depending on the adaptation measure. Next slide. And following the description, we show a bulleted list summarizing the key considerations for the different evaluation criteria. And we tried to compile all this information in easy to read bullets and list all of these various criteria for every measure, so that if anyone's interested in more, you're able to dig into the details with these measures exhibits, which are accessible on the county website. Next slide, please. The third and final document that we've developed for this first phase of the adaptation analysis is the adaptation measures summary matrix. And this document's goal is to compile everything in one place that's easy to look at and understand the relative trade-offs for each of the measures and compare and contrast different measures. Want to point out here we're building upon prior work in the number of applicable adaptation measures, and we've expanded the measures to address utilities and specifically on-site wastewater treatment systems. And we've also included measures and highlighted these measures that are being considered in other ongoing studies. And on this matrix, you can see the asterisk at the name of each measure where they might be used. And we've also summarized these studies in the adaptation memo. Next slide, please. So here's a quick example showing the row for vegetated dunes and for rock revetments. And by taking a look at this adaptation summary matrix, you can see high-level summaries, how each measure ranks within the 5 criteria. You're able to compare and contrast similar measures that might do the same thing, but have other differing considerations if you're thinking about environment or regulatory or social benefits, et cetera. And so this is here for a really high level summary to compare and contrast different adaptation measures. And again, go to those adaptation measures exhibits for more information on each of the criteria. And all of these again are available on the county website. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, we've sort of developed our menu and our set of parameters for how we're going to address potential adaptation for the community. And we're going to now work together as the project team to develop and analyze adaptation pathways. And an adaptation pathway combines multiple adaptation measures together over time to address the different hazards that may affect the community. and adaptation pathways approach helps us to understand, how different measures can be used over time and how you transition from one to the next. This adaptation pathways analysis will include a detailed cost-benefit analysis of 2 example pathways so that we can understand, the cost implications as well as the other considerations in the environment, regulatory, and social and engineering categories. So at this time, I would like to pass things back to Isaac to wrap up with next steps.
Great, thanks, James. Yeah, if you want to go to the next slide. So that was a great overview of the report. There's a lot of awesome information in there, so I really hope you all take a look at it. We'll definitely be here to answer some questions, but before we get into that, just so some of the next steps for our project, we're continuing to do stakeholder engagement with all of those stakeholders that I talked about in the beginning as we start to develop those draft adaptation pathways that James was talking about. We'll be doing that over the summer with the goal of having in close coordination with the local agencies and Stinson homeowners and residents and other stakeholders, having a draft adaptation roadmap with some recommended next steps, hopefully by the end of this fall, with the goal of then presenting that to the public and collecting public comment, and then finalizing that, like I said again earlier, by the end of this year. So those are our next steps. Next slide, I believe, is just for questions, and I will pass it over to Ben to kick off our Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Isaac, and thank you, James. So just as a reminder, there's 2 ways that folks can ask questions. If you go to the bar on the bottom of your Zoom window, if you go to React, you can raise your hand. The chat is now enabled, so you can also type your question directly into the chat. So we're just going to take questions as they come. We'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. We're scheduled to go to 6:30. If we're finding there's more questions than we can get through, we can stay on a little bit later, I think until 6:45 if we need to. So let's just see how the questions go. And again, we can go a little later than 6:30 if we're needing to do that. Okay. I'm seeing a message in the chat from Linda Rudolph. Could you say a little more about what stakeholder engagement with residents will look like?
Yeah, I can take that. Thanks, Linda. Well, so throughout this process, I've been dropping into, whenever I can, the Stinson Beach Village Homeowners Association meetings. And when I can, I usually try and leave an update with the board president or vice president, just so everyone can know what's going on with our project. But going forward, what our plan is to have a Stinson homeowner and resident focus group, as I said, to kind of, once we've developed a little bit more specific information about some of these draft pathways, which will be part of our next step, including a little more specific information about costs, then we really want to we want to get a focus group together and really get some substantial feedback from residents and homeowners. So that'll be one way in which you can be involved. And then, as I mentioned, through those focus groups, we'll be developing that draft, the pathways and roadmap. Once we have that draft ready, we'll present that to the public, and that'll be another opportunity for homeowners, residents, any member of the public to give us feedback and comments on the draft before we finalize.
Thanks, Isaac. All right, looking for additional questions, either through the chat or folks can also raise their hands. I'm not sure if anyone's calling, and you can also ask a question that way.
Ben, I can just jump in actually as we wait to see if there are any other questions.
Okay.
Linda, I forgot to say, please, you're all welcome to go to our website too. We have, as James was saying, we have a lot of great resources there. Our story map is a nice visual way to look at some of these impacts that James was talking about. And we have a survey at the end of that story map. So everyone who fills out that survey has a chance to win a prize. But anyone at any time can leave us a comment through through our website as well, or I'll drop in my email as well. So people are always encouraged to reach out to me at any time.
Thanks, Isaac. I'm seeing another question in the chat. This one's from Helen Kongsgaard. Can you discuss the approach of developing the adaptation measures and assessment criteria before spatializing them on the site? Is this typical for an adaptation pathways planning approach? So would that be you, James?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. Great question. So the approach is kind of multi-prong here for Stinson. One being the work that's already been done, and the ESA myself has assisted the county to develop that countywide adaptation plan. And so back then we identified and put forth a range of measures that we feel fit the context of Stinson Beach. And here for this study, we've revisited that set of adaptation measures to get a little more specific to the community, while the previous study was on a county-wide basis, but honing in on what are the measures that could be used, both in terms of the geomorphic setting at Stinson Beach, or in other words, how do we see the beach moving over time, and the wetland habitats on the lagoon side, and as well as the regulatory setting. So there are somewhat of a filtering process in compiling what's our full list of potential measures. So for example, we didn't include a breakwater offshore of Stinson Beach because there's a national marine sanctuary. So basically professional judgment, building on existing information, and being cognizant of the regulatory and other considerations. We've developed our list of measures. The set of evaluation criteria are standard, recommended in state guidance and other regional guidance documents as a means to evaluate not just the physical effects of an adaptation measure, but those other effects and considerations, like I went through environmental and regulatory. And so, applying our professional judgment and industry standards essentially to come up with these the potential list of measures as well as these evaluation criteria. I hope that sufficiently addresses the question. And yes, the last part. Yeah, this is the kind of standard approach to getting ready for the adaptation pathways approach. We need to understand, well, what are the potential, to use a creek metaphor, what are the stepping stones available to us in the adaptation pathways lexicon, and based on what steps you take, you may have another different set of potential measures. So it's important to know that full list of measures before embarking on that adaptation pathways approach.
Okay, thanks, James. I believe one question was asked through a direct message, but just about the recording of the meeting. And so this recording will be available likely in a week or so, and it's on the project website. So Katie had dropped that in the chat earlier. So the recording of this presentation and the discussion will be available on the project website. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to go to the next question from Jean Gold. A small population plus complicated inputs and solutions to Calle del Arroyo present challenges from a prioritization point of view. What are your thoughts about this for implementation in the broader county picture?
I can jump in for a sec, and then James, if you want to maybe follow up. But yeah, thanks, Jean, for the question. Obviously, we know Seadrift is very interested and reliant, right, on Calle del Arroyo. But what we have in this report is general information about what it would take to raise roads, right? So not just Calle del Arroyo, but there's a lot of other private roads in Stinson Beach that are vulnerable to sea level rise and flooding. So this information here isn't particular to Calle del Arroyo, but it's good information that I hope the community can take a look at, keep in mind for some of their own private roads and some of the considerations that it would take to to, like I said, to raise it or take another action. In terms of more particular information about Calle del Arroyo and others, that's going to be part of our next step. So as we start to get into the adaptation pathways, we'll be able to dive a little bit more into some of that criteria that James was talking about: environmental impact, regulatory feasibility, cost, for a subset of measures that we're carrying forward as part of the adaptation pathways. And James, I don't know if you want to.
That was great.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Isaac. I'm just going to keep going through the chat. The next question is from Daniel Yost. I realize predictions are hard, especially about the future, but please say more about predicted sea level rise in Stinson. I saw the data point on 1.6 feet estimated in 2060. Any earlier predictions, or all just a guess at this stage?
I'm happy to take that one. And yeah, in a nutshell, it is a guess, based on our collective knowledge as humans and climate scientists and sea level rise modelers. But yeah, 1.6 feet at 2060, that's specifically the projection of sea level rise for the medium high risk aversion scenario. So this is a precautionary projection of sea level rise, and it's the standard to look at precautionary projections when you're talking about community-wide planning and planning for a large amount of property. And we are going to consider that timing as we evaluate the adaptation pathways. The current state guidance provides more information on potential sea level rise, and so I refer you to the latest OPC 2024 sea level rise guidance on those scenarios, and that helps to also provide storylines. That's a really great component of the new guidance that sort of well, how do you get to 2060 1.6 feet of sea level rise? It's the emissions that's going on. It's the human behavior and how different societies can shift their carbon emissions. And it's also based on the science of glacier melt and ice sheet loss, and a number of considerations that go into these scenarios. So as is the industry standard, we're taking a precautionary look to see how bad things might be, and in reality, we hope that the sea level rise is slower than this worst case projection, and in fact, our monitoring and our roadmap will outline the process for the community to monitor and adapt only as needed, and not to overreact and adapt too early. So that's kind of the overall goal of an adaptation roadmap. Is to chart the course and understand what the potential worst case is, but only really implement as needed based on the progression of hazards and progression of sea level rise.
And if I could just follow up a little bit, I think James said this earlier too, but that 1.6 feet of sea level rise by 2060, it's based on the San Francisco tide gauge and historical data, right? That's then taken some of the global climate models and sea level rise models and downscaled and pegged them to that tide gauge. So it is based on local data.
Thanks for making that point.
Yeah.
Okay, next question is from Eric Wilcox. Is it fair to say that the deeper sections of beach, that dune enhancement is suggested as opposed to narrow sections needed armoring? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll take that one. And yeah, it's yeah, I know it's complicated. That's my favorite line. It's also, it depends. That's my other favorite line as an engineer. But the issue of shoreline armoring and adaptation alternatives is including dunes or cobble berms. The counties looked at this with the nature-based adaptation feasibility study. Previously, we looked at the beach side of the community in Stinson and evaluated a couple of nature-based alternatives to shoreline protection that included basically different dune configurations with or without a buried cobble berm. And we went through the shoreline of Stinson and created reaches, sea drift, and especially sea drift the west half of Sea Drift is the narrowest existing beach condition. And so in that study, we only evaluated cobble berm in addition to the baseline armoring as the potential measure there. But to your point, you're right in that the wider beach you have, the more room you have to implement a dune and or cobble berm as a more natural nature-based measure to reduce erosion and flooding risk.
Thanks, James. The next question's from Mark Sarkeesian. As part of the study so far, was there a comparative study of past flooding events considering frequency and magnitude with those that have been more current?
Yeah, so we, for this study, built upon the county study, and one of the nuances in this update on the vulnerability assessment was to consider the impacts of extreme events like an extreme coastal storm, 100-year storm, as well as a regular spring tide or like a monthly high tide. And we looked at those two conditions for each sea level rise amount. So over time with sea level rise, we can see what might be impacted by a major storm, but also what will start to become inundated regularly on a monthly basis in order to distinguish the difference in adaptation approaches that might be used for a regular recurring multiple times a month inundation compared to a potential risky and damaging flood event that may not happen that often.
Okay, the next question's from Jeff Lumens. At the beginning of the process, there was a meeting in which during the Q&A, it was stated the county was not seeking funding to actually implement any of the solutions, and that effectively it would be left to other stakeholders to raise money and or drive remediation projects. Is that still the county's policy? And if so, especially given the largest section of the beach requiring measures such as dune revegetation are under county jurisdiction and not under other agency jurisdictions, how will we put these ideas into practice?
I'll take that one.
Thanks, Leslie.
Yeah, so I believe what we said, or at least what was meant before, was that we don't have funding for these projects. But one of the things that we are doing in this project is providing a way for communities to move forward on their own without county funding to protect their homes. And so there will be a lot of different ways that communities can collectively collaborate, work together to fund projects and suggestions for funding ideas in the next phase of this report. But no, this is a grant funded project and we don't have funding for the next phase.
Thanks, Leslie. Okay, let's see. I'm seeing a question from Helen Kongsgaard. If there's time, could you discuss the narrow salt marsh or mudflat area and adaptation options for that ecotone?
James, you want to cover that?
Yeah. So essentially, marsh habitats are they exist based on natural settling and accretion of fine silts and through vegetation and the interactive process in these embayments such as Bolinas Lagoon. And with and so each lagoon, depending on the conditions in the watershed and sediment delivery, they have a natural rate of accretion or a rate of vertical growth of these marshes. And with rapid sea level rise, up to a point, the rate of sea level rise outpaces the rate of a marsh to naturally accrete. And so you end up drowning out the vegetated marsh, and the marsh habitats over time convert to open water essentially without action. In the Bolinas Lagoon area, there's a couple of different ideas, different ways to help vegetated marshes to adapt. The measures are in a lot of ways focused on, what can be done around the development, but in the context of marsh migration with sea level rise, by having a ecotone levee or a flatter slope along a flood control levee, that helps to give space for that marsh habitat to move up with sea level rise and gives it that space. Whereas right now the marsh kind of comes up to maybe a steep scarp, or it comes up to the edge of the shoreline highway or to the bluff that borders the lagoon. And then under those conditions, there's not much room for those marshes to slowly migrate up with sea level rise. So utilizing a flat dissipative ecotone slope in the measures to address flooding for the rest of the community, we can at the same time give a little bit of resiliency space for those marsh habitats that exist along the fringes of Stinson and Seadrift. There are other measures that could be used to help facilitate marsh resilience with sea level rise, such as sediment augmentation. That's been an experimental approach that's being used down in Southern California at the Seal Beach National Wildlife Refuge, and that's in the associated with the military. But that it seems like a kind of a heavy lift and an expensive method, and especially given the regulatory setting and the sensitive habitats, we haven't included that measure. But yeah, considering the marsh habitats with sea level rise is an important component of the study, both because of their environmental value, but also their recreational and hazard reduction value.
And if I could just add on to that, so Helen, there's a great resource on our website. I'm going to continue to plug it. We have a nice brochure that identifies a lot of ongoing plans and projects in the Stinson-Bolinas Lagoon area. So on that brochure and on our website, you can find a little more information about the South End project, which is looking at the feasibility of an ecotone levee on the backside of Stinson, as well as what we call the Bolinas Y project, which is a Marin County Parks project that is improving marsh habitat while addressing some flood vulnerability along the Bolinas Y road and Highway 1. So I definitely would encourage you to check those out. And then also just wanted to kind of say to Jeff's question, definitely what Leslie said, but also don't forget part of our project, even though it's a grant funded project and we don't have funds to implement anything, one of the steps that will be part of our roadmap will be identifying some funding opportunities for the community to pursue.
Thanks, Isaac. Seeing one more question from Daniel Yost. Is there particular advice you have for homeowners concerned about this topic at this stage? Participate in this process, but certainly more. Any thoughts on that, Isaac?
Yeah, as I said, I'm happy. Please reach out to me if you're really concerned. We've had meetings, we've talked with homeowners. I try and make myself as available as possible. I understand a lot of homeowners are really concerned with short term. We did send out, I think in our newsletter last year, some ideas from our Department of Public Works in terms of how you can kind of reduce your home's flood risk in the short term. So I'm happy to share those resources as well. But yeah, I know it's not what a lot of people want to hear maybe at this point is to participate in our process, but just please, yeah, be patient. As I said, we're really hoping to have some good conversations with stakeholders this summer, and that as we start to develop that draft plan and roadmap.
Okay, great. Thanks, Isaac. Just a quick time check. We've got about 5 minutes left. Those are all the questions I'm seeing. And I think what we can do with the remaining time we have is there's certainly some questions around implementation and how to actually get the projects done. A related effort to that, the county currently has a climate change governance project. And so I'd like to invite Chris Chu from the county just to give a quick update on that before we close for this evening. So Chris, if you could give a quick update, that would be really appreciated.
Great, thanks, Ben. Is it possible for me to share my screen?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Just wanted to put up a quick little one pager and just mention that the county has begun a sea level rise adaptation governance study. This is looking at both the bay and the coast side, so countywide, looking at how the county organizes itself to make decisions and how we implement some of these big adaptation projects across the county. At this point, we've just kicked off. We have our consultant team helping with this process. One of the first actions is really to engage, is to engage stakeholders across the county on a couple of different areas of concern. One is just sort of what's needed for kind of this adaptation governance model itself. And so, where are the risks? What's needed next? What kinds of ways could the county actually engage to help move adaptation projects forward? And the other part of it will also be looking at kind of who and what that governance structure actually looks like. The plan is after a period of engagement and outreach, there'll be a governance structure identified. That will actually lead to have a set of recommendations and the county board of supervisors accepting kind of and selecting a governance structure. There's a whole second phase of this project, which is really focused on identifying and evaluating kind of the county itself and our staff to see how we can best actually support this governance model that's selected. So there'll be a lot of additional outreach over the next couple of months to reach out to find folks who do want to have conversations around the governance study itself, around kind of participation in the governance model, but also just input on adaptation and kind of what's needed across the county in order to comply with state mandates, to move projects like this forward. And so encourage you all to participate in that as that comes up. We're getting our website up and running again, and so there'll be information soon, but I'll share this with Isaac, the one pager, and have that shared and posted on our website very soon. That's it.
Sounds good. Thanks very much, Chris. Appreciate the update. Okay, well, we're about at the hour here, and we really appreciate everyone taking the time out on your evenings to get an update and to interact with the team. And we'll certainly be in touch for the next time when we have new information to provide. Again, please do go to the website. There's a lot of good information there, and I think and Isaac certainly is more than happy to speak with people in the interim, just to talk through any questions you have. So thanks again, everyone, for taking the time, and have a great evening, and we'll be back in touch soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Ooh, Daniel, I can answer that last question real quick. On our website, you'll find a way to sign up for our listserv.